In this video, we're going to talk about the lead-based paint disclosure and how to fill it out appropriately. We're also going to talk about your disclosure requirements using the complying with the lead-based paint law, licensing notice to seller landlord, as well as the protect your family from lead in your home pamphlet for buyers. In the description below, I have a copy of the lead-based paint rider, and you might want to print that out before the video begins because I do have some red wording on there that are just notes for you. Feel free to write on that, highlight it, whatever you need to do so you have that moving forward. Let's jump right in to the lead-based paint disclosure. We're going to start at the very top. It says this is the comprehensive rider to the residential contract for sale and purchase. So this goes along with not only the standard residential contract for sale and purchase, but also the as-is residential contract for sale and purchase. It says this form has been approved by Florida Realtors and the Florida Bar. If initialed by all parties, the clauses below will incorporate it into the Florida Realtor, Florida Bar residential contract for sale and purchase between, and we're going to put the seller or seller's names on the first line and the buyer or buyer's names on the second line. It goes on to say concerning the property described as, and we're going to put the address on that line. So the buyers and the sellers are going to be initialing this addendum on the top, and we have more work to do on the bottom. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at what needs to be selected and or initialed on the bottom of this page. So taking a look at the lead-based paint warning statement, it says every purchaser of an interest in residential real property on which the residential dwelling was built prior to 1978 is notified that such property may present exposure to lead from lead-based paint that may place young children at risk of developing lead poisoning. Lead poisoning in young children may produce permanent neurological damage, including learning disabilities, reduced intelligence quotient, behavioral problems, and impaired memory. Lead poisoning also poses a particular risk to pregnant women. The seller of any interest in residential real property is required to provide the buyer with any information on lead-based paint hazards and risk assessments or inspection in the seller's possession, and notify the buyer of any lead-based paint hazards. A risk assessment or inspection for possible lead-based paint hazards is recommended prior to purchase. Now we're going to take a look at the seller's part here. It says the seller's disclosure, and they're to initial. The seller must initial each of these lines, A and B, and then they're going to select one box under A and one box under B. So they're going to initial on line A, and line A says presence of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards, check one below. The first option, known lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards are present in the housing. The second option, seller has no knowledge of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards in the housing. Item B, the seller or sellers is also going to initial this line, and they're going to make a choice here as well. It says records and reports available to the seller. Check one below. The seller has provided the buyer with all available records and reports pertaining to lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards in the housing, and they're going to list the documents. Or the seller has no reports or records pertaining to lead paint or lead paint hazards in the housing. Immediately following this video, we're going to take a look at the notice to the seller, and this is something that the listing agent is going to give to the seller, which outlines their responsibilities by law and what they have to disclose. It's also going to ask the seller at that time if they have any information and what information they do possess. So that is a form that should be in all of your listing presentations or with your listing paperwork if you're listing a home that was built prior to 1978. Now we're going to move on to the buyer's acknowledgement and what they're going to sign and or initial. So the buyers may or may not initial item C. Item C says the buyer has received copies of all information listed above. If there is no information listed above, if the seller has no information and has provided no information, then the buyer is not going to initial line C. If the seller does have information to provide and has identified that in their section, then the buyer would initial line C. For item D, it says the buyer has received the pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. This should be provided by either the listing agent. It should be attached to the listing if they have a home prior to 1978, and the buyer's agent should certainly give that to their customer. Even if that is not a part of the listing paperwork, it is your responsibility as the selling agent to provide that information to your customer. So make sure that the buyer is receiving the pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. And you can print that for them or send it to them via email. And then they will initial on line D that, yes, in fact, they have received that pamphlet. They're also going to initial on line E, and they're going to check one below. So the buyer has either received a 10-day opportunity or other mutually agreed upon period to conduct a risk assessment or inspection for the presence of lead paint or lead paint hazards, or waive the opportunity to conduct a risk assessment or inspection for the presence of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards. So again, they're going to initial line E and make a choice on one of those. Next, we come to the licensee's acknowledgement. The listing agent must provide complying with lead-based paint law licensee notice to the seller or landlord. Again, we're going to talk about that briefly right after this. And they're going to initial on the line indicating that the licensee has informed the seller of the seller's obligation under 42 U.S. Constitution 4852D and is aware of the licensee's responsibility to ensure compliance. The way that you're guaranteeing that compliance is because you're going to have that notice signed by the seller or sellers, and you're going to keep that as part of your file. It goes on to talk about the certification of accuracy. The following parties have received the information above and certify to the best of their knowledge that the information they are provided is true and accurate. The seller or sellers are going to sign, the buyer or buyers are going to sign, the listing licensee is going to sign, and the selling licensee is going to sign. Goes on to say any person or persons who knowingly violate the provisions of Residential Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act of 1992 may be subject to civil or criminal penalties and potential triple damage in a private civil lawsuit. So this is very, very serious, and we want to make sure we're taking it seriously and we have all the protections for ourselves and for our customers. So this is the complying with lead-based paint law licensee notice to the seller. I'm not going to read through this entire section here, but it begins by saying, I am notifying you of your responsibilities under the Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act of 1992 and its implementing regulations. As the owner of a residential dwelling unit built in 1977 or earlier, you have the following disclosure and other requirements. For the purpose of this document, LBP will mean lead-based paint and LBPH will mean lead-based paint hazards, which are conditions that cause exposure to lead from lead-contaminated dust, soil, or paint that is deteriorated or present in accessible surfaces or surfaces that rub together like doors and windows. So it goes on to talk about before you sign the contract or lease, before you sign a sales contract requirement, lease requirements, record retention requirements, and the impact of law disclosure. And the RNF here, this information sheet was provided by, and if you're the listing agent, you're putting your name here to the seller or landlord, and you're going to date this instrument. And then the seller or landlord is going to fill out the rest of it. So the seller or landlord makes the following disclosures: lead-based paint and lead-based paint hazards in the housing. Either the seller has no knowledge of lead-based paint in the housing, or the seller or landlord knows of the following lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazard in the housing, and they're going to describe and provide additional documentation. And that would be listed here. The second part talks about available records and reports. Either the seller landlord has no records or reports regarding the lead-based paint hazard in housing, or the seller landlord has available the following documents regarding the lead-based paint in the housing. The seller and or landlord is going to sign, and they're going to also initial at the bottom here. They're also going to be initialing on page 1 of this document as well. So while you're taking the listing and you're preparing the lead-based paint rider, you're also going to do this first. So you're going to talk about what the responsibility is to the seller or the landlord. They're going to give any information that they have. You're going to retain this for your broker's records. And then you're going to fill out the first form that we talked about, the lead-based paint disclosure. So I will have links in the description below of this document here with the notes in red for your reference. I'll also link the complying with lead-based paint law licensee notice to seller and landlord. And I will also put down there the Protect Your Family from Lead-Based Paint in Your Home pamphlet, so you have easy access to that. Of course, being a member of Florida Realtors, you always have access to this through Transaction Desk, Form Simplicity, or whatever system your broker is using, AppFile, SkySlope, whatever it may be. Those forms will be available for you in there as well.